The lawyer's number lit up my phone screen 4 days after my own birthday dinner, and I remember thinking, there it is. 4 days earlier, my brother-in-law had stood up in front of 20 guests and demanded I hand over my grandfather's house like it was his to ask for. I hadn't argued. I hadn't raised my voice. I'd only said 3 words, "I sold it," and watched a grown man's face go the color of old paper. What none of them knew was that I'd been planning this moment for over a year, and that phone call wasn't going to bring them what they wanted. It was going to confirm everything my grandfather already suspected about the people sitting at that table. My name is Alexa Warren, and for most of my adult life, my family has treated me like a placeholder. Not a person exactly, more like a line item they hadn't gotten around to collecting yet. I'm a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, 20 years of service behind me this spring, and in all that time I can count on one hand the number of times someone in my family asked me how I was actually doing. Not where I was stationed, not what I might inherit, just how I was doing. They never asked because they already had an answer that suited them. Alexa's fine, Alexa's tough. Alexa doesn't need anything from us, and in a strange way they were right. I didn't need anything from them. What I needed I'd already gotten from someone else, from my grandfather, a man who raised me through the parts of my childhood. My own parents were too busy or too tired to handle. He had a house on a lake in Montana, an old 2-story place with a wraparound porch and a dock that groaned every summer when the ice finally let go. I spent more nights of my childhood in that house than I did in my parents' place across town. He taught me to fish off that dock. He taught me to change a tire in the gravel driveway. He taught me, without ever saying it directly, what it looked like when someone loved you without expecting anything back. He passed 2 years ago in early spring with the lake still half frozen outside his window. And when the will was read, there was no ambiguity in it at all. The house, the land, the dock, the whole rambling piece of Montana he'd built his life around went to me. Not split, not shared. Mine in his handwriting, notarized and airtight. My family did not take it well. Emily, my sister, is 42, 4 years older than me, and she has spent her whole life believing the universe owes her a slightly better deal than the one she got. When she heard about the will, she didn't cry. She got quiet in that particular way she gets quiet, and then she said the thing I knew she'd been thinking since the day Grandpa died. He must have been manipulated. There's no way he meant for it to be like this. Mark, her husband, wasn't quiet at all. Mark is 45. Runs a small construction supply business that's been bleeding money for longer than anyone in the family wants to admit. And he has never, in the years I've known him, passed up an opportunity to explain to me how the real world works, as though 2 decades in uniform had left me sheltered instead of seasoned. At the reading of the will, he laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Well, she'll have to sell it eventually. Nobody keeps a house like that forever, not on a soldier's pension." I didn't correct him. I didn't tell him what my rank actually paid, or what I'd quietly built while he assumed I was scraping by. I've never seen the point of explaining myself to people who've already decided who I am. My grandfather used to say something similar, actually. One of the last real conversations we had sitting on that porch with 2 mugs of coffee going cold between us. "Don't ever tell anyone your plans before they're finished," he told me. "People don't attack a plan. They attack a person hoping the plan falls apart along with them." I didn't fully understand what he meant at the time. I do now. For 2 years, I kept my word to him. I didn't discuss the house. I didn't discuss money. When family gatherings turned toward the topic, and they always did eventually, dressed up as concern or fairness or tradition, I changed the subject or excused myself entirely. I let them believe whatever they needed to believe, that I was sentimental about the place, that I hadn't decided anything yet, that I was, as Emily liked to put it, still processing. What I was actually doing was executing a plan I'd started putting together almost from the moment the funeral ended, when my grandfather himself had quietly set in motion before he ever got sick. But that's a part of the story for later. This year, for the first time in longer than I can remember, my family volunteered to throw me a birthday dinner. Emily called me herself, her voice bright, with an enthusiasm I hadn't heard directed at me since I was maybe 12 years old. "A nice restaurant," she said. "The whole family. A celebration long overdue." I said yes, because saying no would have raised questions I wasn't ready to answer yet. and because some small stubborn part of me wanted to see how far they'd go. I remember sitting in my car outside that restaurant the night of the dinner keys still in the ignition engine ticking as it cooled and feeling something settle in my chest that wasn't quite dread and wasn't quite anticipation. It was recognition. I knew the way you know weather is coming before the sky actually changes that this dinner had nothing to do with celebrating me. I was right. I just didn't know yet how badly the night would go for them. The restaurant Emily picked was the kind of place with cloth napkins and a wine list thicker than most paperbacks tucked into a converted brick building downtown that used to be a bank. I remember thinking that was almost funny, given what the night would turn into. We had a private room in the back, a long table set for 12 string lights, strung along exposed beams overhead. My parents were already there when I arrived, along with a handful of cousins, an aunt, a few of Emily's friends who'd apparently been invited to pad out the guest list. For the first hour, it was almost pleasant. My father made a toast that was actually kind, mentioning my last deployment, saying he was proud of me, and for a second I let myself believe this was real. My mother asked about my apartment, my next assignment, whether I was eating enough. Small things, ordinary things, the kind of attention I used to wait years for. I should have known better than to relax. We'd just finished the main course. I remember my plate still half full, a piece of salmon going cold under a wilting sprig of dill when Mark tapped his knife against his wine glass. The sound cut through the low murmur of conversation, like something breaking. "So while we're all here," he said, standing glass raised, that easy salesman's smile spreading across his face, the one he uses on clients right before he asks them for money they don't have to give. "I think it's time we talked about something important." The temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. I felt it before I understood why. Emily's friends went quiet. My cousin across the table suddenly found her napkin fascinating. "The house," Mark said, like he was announcing a toast to good health. "Grandpa's place on the lake. What's the plan, Alexa? When are we selling? When do we split it?" I set my fork down slowly. "There's no we, Mark. The house was left to me." He laughed, that same laugh from the will reading but sharper now performing for the table. "Come on, we're family. Nobody actually thinks Grandpa meant for one person to keep something that big all to herself. That's not how families work. It's exactly how his will works," I said. "I've read it, several times." Emily leaned in, then her voice pitched low but not low enough meant to sound reasonable, and landing somewhere closer to rehearsed. "Alexa, we're not trying to take anything from you. We just think it's only fair that a house like that gets shared. You've got your career, your pension, you don't even live there. Mark and I have kids, we have real financial pressure." I looked at her at the careful arrangement of her face, sympathy stretched thin over something harder underneath. And I thought about all the times growing up she'd told me the exact opposite, that fairness meant everyone getting what they'd earned, not what they needed. Funny how principles shift shape depending on which side of the table you're sitting on. "Ong noi jo the tien vin huve," she said, switching without thinking into the language our grandmother had spoken at home, the phrase slipping out of her like it always did when she got emotional. Grandpa couldn't have been that biased, except he could. He was, and we both knew it. My mother, who had been so warm 20 minutes earlier, now looked at me with an expression I recognized instantly, the look she used to give me as a teenager, when she wanted me to smooth something over, to be the reasonable one to absorb the tension so everyone else could stay comfortable. "Sweetheart, I do think you should consider splitting it. It would mean so much to your sister." My father said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. He nodded slow and non-committal, the way he'd nodded through 30 years of letting my mother and Emily decide what fairness looked like in this family. I sat there and understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful that this entire evening, the toast, the kind words, the questions about my apartment had been a setup. 20 people invited not to celebrate me, but to witness me being pressured into folding. A public stage built specifically so that saying no would look cruel and saying yes would look inevitable. Mark wasn't finished. He'd had 2 glasses of wine and his voice was climbing, drawing eyes from the tables nearby, the kind of scene I imagine he thought would embarrass me into compliance. "You know what, forget the money talk. Just sign it over. Put Emily's name on the deed alongside yours or transfer it outright. It's the right thing to do." 20 faces turned toward me. I could feel the weight of all of them waiting to see if the quiet army officer would do what she always did: absorb it, smooth it over, keep the peace. I thought about my grandfather's porch. I thought about his coffee going cold between us, and the way he used to say that people reveal exactly who they are the moment they think something belongs to them by right instead of by love. I looked directly at Mark, and I let the silence stretch just long enough that he leaned forward slightly, sensing victory. "I sold it," I said. 3 words. No volume behind them, no performance. Just fact dropped into the middle of his triumph like a stone into still water. The room didn't just go quiet. It went still, the specific stillness of people watching a plan collapse in real time. Mark's wine glass, tilted in his hand, caught itself before spilling, his face draining of color so completely that for a moment he looked almost gray under the string lights. "Sold it," Emily repeated, like the words didn't make sense in that order. "Sold it to who when you can't have—" I didn't answer her. I picked up my napkin, folded it once, and set it beside my plate. I signaled the waiter paid for my own meal in cash so there'd be no argument about who owed what, and stood. "Happy birthday to me," I said quietly, and walked out of that private room without looking back, leaving 20 people and one very pale brother-in-law sitting in a silence none of them knew how to fill. My phone started ringing before I'd even made it to my car. I sat behind the wheel for a moment, watching Emily's name light up the screen, over and over, the calls stacking on top of each other, like she thought sheer volume might change my answer. I didn't pick up. I drove home in silence, the city lights blurring past the windows, and by the time I walked through my own front door, I had 11 missed calls and a string of texts that read less like messages from a sister and more like a person watching her house burn down in real time. "Did you actually sell it?" Alexa, answer me. "This isn't funny. Call me back right now." Mark's texts came in a different register entirely. Shorter, angrier, punctuated with a kind of controlled panic I hadn't seen from him before. "We need to talk. Tonight." "This isn't a joke, Alexa. You don't understand what you've done." I remember reading that last line twice. "You don't understand what you've done. Not what you've done to me or what you've done to the family, just what you've done. Like I'd broken something bigger than a dinner party, something he hadn't shown any of us the shape of yet." I didn't call back that night. I made myself a cup of tea, sat on my couch, and let the phone buzz itself quiet on the coffee table. Some part of me wanted to feel guilty for how easily I'd delivered those 3 words. I didn't. What I felt instead was something closer to relief, the way you feel when a wound you've been favoring for months finally gets lanced. Over the next 2 days, the family did what families like mine always do when they don't get the answer they want. They stopped asking me directly and started investigating instead. Emily called our mutual cousin, who works in property records at the county office, to see if a sale had actually been filed. Mark, according to what I pieced together later, drove out to the lake house itself and walked the property line like a man inspecting a crime scene, then knocked on the door of the nearest neighbor, an older woman named Dot, who'd known my grandfather for 30 years, trying to get her to confirm who'd bought it. Dot, bless her, told him she didn't know anything, which was true. Nobody did. The paperwork on my end had been handled quietly months earlier, with a level of confidentiality built directly into the terms of sale. There was no realtor sign in the yard, no listing anyone could pull up online. As far as the public record showed, the transaction existed, but the identity of the buyer was sealed pending final closing conditions. It was by design a locked door with no visible hinges. Mark's panic only deepened the less he found. And it was around this time, watching the shape of his reaction from a careful distance, that I started putting together something I hadn't fully let myself consider. Before, Mark's interest in that house had never been sentimental. It had never really even been about fairness, whatever language Emily wrapped it in. It was about money he didn't have and couldn't get any other way. I found out later through a mutual friend who worked in his industry that Mark's construction supply business had been underwater for nearly 2 years, not failing outright but drowning slowly, the kind of debt that eats a company from the inside, while the owner keeps smiling at ribbon cuttings and Chamber of Commerce dinners. He'd taken out loans against inventory that had lost value. He'd missed payments he'd papered over with new worse loans. And sometime last winter, in a bid to keep the whole structure from collapsing, he'd gone looking for investors willing to put fresh capital into the business. The problem was nobody wanted to invest in a company that looked like his on paper, so Mark had done something I don't think he ever intended for the rest of us to find out about. In private conversations with at least 2 potential investors, he'd represented my grandfather's lake house, a property he had no legal claim to whatsoever as collateral. Future collateral. He called it banking on the assumption that family pressure would eventually force me to either sell and split the proceeds or sign the deed over to Emily, at which point he'd have access to it through her. He told these investors, according to what I eventually pieced together, that the matter was just a formality, that the family was already in agreement that within a matter of weeks he'd be able to leverage the property's value to secure the funding he needed. He'd apparently gone so far as to draft a preliminary agreement with one investor, tying a portion of the loan structure directly to that future collateral banking his entire rescue plan on a house that was never his to promise. Which meant that the moment I said those 3 words at dinner, I sold it, I hadn't just disappointed my family. I had, without knowing the specifics at the time, pulled the one card out from under Mark that his entire financial survival was resting on. That explained the color draining from his face at the restaurant. That explained the texts that read like panic instead of anger. That explained why by the 4th day after that dinner, Mark had stopped calling me directly and started making calls to a different kind of number entirely. He'd hired a lawyer. I found out through Emily, who called me sounding scared in a way I hadn't heard from her since we were kids, telling me Mark said we needed to get everything sorted before this gets messy. I remember standing in my kitchen phone pressed to my ear and feeling the last of my hesitation about what I'd done settle into something firm and unmovable. Mark had built an entire rescue plan on a foundation of sand, using my inheritance as a promise he had no right to make. And now that the sand had shifted, he wasn't coming to apologize. He was coming to fight for something he never owned in the first place. To understand why I did what I did with that house, you have to go back further than the will, further, even than my grandfather's diagnosis. You have to go back to a conversation we had on his porch about a year before he died, on one of those late September evenings in Montana when the air starts carrying the first real bite of autumn and the lake turns the color of pewter just before sunset. He'd been quieter than usual that year. I noticed it on my visits home between deployments, a kind of watchfulness in him, like a man doing math in his head, that he wasn't ready to share the answer to. That particular evening we sat out on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee, the steam curling up into the cold air, and he set his mug down on the railing and looked out at the water for a long moment before he spoke. "This house isn't a gift, Alexa," he said. "Not the way you think." I remember laughing a little confused. "What is it then?" "It's a test," he said, "and I already know how most of them are going to answer it." I didn't understand what he meant, not fully, not that night. He explained it to me slowly, the way he explained everything patiently without drama, like a man laying out tools before a job rather than a man confessing something painful. He told me he'd watched Emily and Mark for years, watched the way they talked about money when they thought he wasn't paying attention, watched Mark's business struggle, and watched the particular way Mark's eyes moved around this house every time he visited, cataloging its value instead of its memories. After I'm gone, he told me, "There's going to be a fight over this place. Not because anyone loved it the way you and I loved it, because it's the only thing left worth fighting over. And I need you to understand something before that fight happens. You're not obligated to save it. You're not obligated to keep it standing exactly as it is out of some duty to preserve every board and shingle. What matters is what you do with what it represents." He told me in that conversation, and a few others like it over the following months, that he didn't want the house itself protected, so much as he wanted it protected from the exact kind of use Mark would eventually try to put it to, leveraged, mortgaged, turned into someone else's bailout. He didn't say Mark's name specifically that night, not in so many words, but he didn't have to. We both knew who he meant. Do whatever you need to do, he told me. Sell it if you want, just don't let it become a rope for someone else to hang their debts on. I carried that conversation with me for the 2 years after he passed, turning it over, slowly deciding what it actually meant in practice. And about 8 months before that birthday dinner, I finally acted on it. I didn't sell the house to a private buyer looking for a vacation property, and I didn't sell it to a developer looking to subdivide the land. I sold it after months of careful, quiet negotiation to a regional historical preservation trust, a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting properties with architectural or local significance, which the lake house qualified for, given its age, and the role it had played in the town's early logging history. Something my grandfather had always been quietly proud of and rarely mentioned. The terms of the sale were specific, and I'd insisted on every one of them. The house could never be demolished. It could not be resold for a minimum of 15 years, and any future sale would require approval from the trust's board to ensure it stayed protected. All records of the transaction would remain sealed until the sale fully closed, specifically to prevent exactly the kind of speculative leveraging Mark had apparently tried to build his business rescue around. And the trust paid well above market value for the property, understanding its historical worth, in a sale that took nearly 7 months of paperwork, appraisals, and legal review to finalize completely. I didn't take that money and put it toward myself. I didn't buy anything, didn't invest it in my own name, didn't let it sit accumulating interest in some account with my name on it. Instead, working with the same lawyer who'd handled the sale, I moved the entire proceeds into a scholarship fund for children of active duty and fallen service members, along with a modest ongoing contribution to 2 local charities my grandfather had quietly supported for decades, without ever telling anyone in the family. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision born out of spite at a dinner table. It wasn't retaliation dressed up as principle. It was the conclusion of something I had been planning carefully and deliberately for the better part of a year, a decision my grandfather had, in his own quiet way, set in motion long before he ever got sick, long before any of us knew how the story would end. What Mark didn't know, sitting across that restaurant table demanding I sign the deed over to my sister, was that there was no deed left to sign. What Emily didn't understand, dialing my number over and over in the days that followed, was that the house they were fighting over no longer existed as an asset anyone could leverage, borrow against, or divide. It existed instead as a small protected piece of Montana history, and as a handful of scholarships that would put kids like the one I used to be through college. My grandfather had asked me all those months ago on that porch to make sure the house never became a rope for someone else's debts. I'd kept my promise. I just hadn't told anyone how yet. 4 days after that birthday dinner, I was on base halfway through reviewing logistics reports in my office when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail out of habit, but something made me pick up. "Alexa Warren," I said. "Colonel Warren, this is David Chen from Whitfield and Associates. I'm the attorney who handled the sale of your grandfather's property." His voice was calm, measured, the voice of a man who spends his days delivering news other people don't want to hear. "I have your sister, her husband, and your parents on the line. They've requested a joint call regarding the transaction. I wanted you present before we proceeded." I set down my pen. "Put them through." There was a click, and then Emily's voice came through first, tight, and rehearsed like she'd practiced this in the car on the way to wherever she was calling from. "Alexa, we need to talk about undoing this. All of us. We think there's been a serious mistake, and we want to understand our options for reversing the sale." Mark's voice came in right behind hers, louder, sharper. "This isn't a request, Alexa. That house should never have left the family. We want it back, or we want our share of whatever you got for it, and if we don't get either one, we're prepared to take this to court." My mother's voice followed, softer, aiming for reasonable. "Sweetheart, please. We just want to fix this like a family." I let the silence sit for a moment before I spoke. "David, would you like to walk them through the terms?" "Of course," Mr. Chen said, and his tone didn't change at all, didn't rise to meet Mark's volume. didn't soften to match Emily's pleading. He simply laid it out plainly the way you'd read off a grocery list. The sale was executed in full compliance with the terms of the will, which granted Colonel Warren sole and unrestricted ownership of the property. The transaction was completed with a licensed buyer, all disclosures were made appropriately, and the deed transfer was finalized and recorded 11 days ago. There is no legal mechanism by which any of you as non-parties to either the will or the sale could compel a reversal. That's not good enough, Mark snapped. There has to be something. Undue influence maybe. Coercion. Maybe the old man wasn't in his right mind when he wrote that will. I felt something tighten in my chest at that, a flash of real anger I hadn't let myself feel yet through all of this. My grandfather, sharp and clear-eyed until the very end, being reduced to a legal loophole by a man who'd never once visited him in the hospital, Mr. Chen's response came evenly without heat. Mr. Sullivan, if you intend to pursue a claim of undue influence or diminished capacity, I'd strongly advise you retain independent counsel before making that allegation further, particularly on a recorded call. The medical and legal documentation supporting the will's validity is extensive. Mark didn't back down immediately. He kept pushing his voice, climbing toward something less controlled. You people think you can just hide a sale, seal the records, and walk away clean. I have people asking me questions right now because of what she did. I have obligations riding on that property. There was a beat of silence on the line, and I understood listening to it that Mark had just said something he hadn't meant to say out loud in front of everyone. Emily's voice came through a second later, quieter, confused. Mark, what obligations? What is he talking about? Mark didn't answer her. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear faintly someone shifting in a chair, the small sounds of people realizing a conversation had just changed shape. Mr. Chen moved the call forward smoothly, as though he hadn't noticed the crack that had just opened up in the room on the other end of the line. Though I suspected he'd noticed everything. To be clear for the record, any attempt to interfere with this legally completed transaction to contact the buyer directly, or to make public claims disputing its validity, will be treated as potential grounds for legal action on behalf of my client. I'd encourage everyone on this call to consult their own attorney before taking any further steps. You're threatening us, Mark said, but the volume had gone out of it. What was left sounded more like fear than anger. I'm informing you of your legal exposure, Mr. Chen said. There's a difference. Nobody spoke for a long moment. I sat in my office chair, phone pressed to my ear, and looked out the window at the motor pool across the yard. Vehicles lined up in neat rows under a gray sky, and I felt something settle in me that I can only describe as quiet. Is there anything else? Mr. Chen asked into the silence. There wasn't. The call ended a few moments later without goodbyes, without the kind of closure any of them had clearly been hoping for when they dialed in. I sat at my desk for a while after not moving, listening to the hum of the building around me, and I thought about the word Mark had used without meaning to. Obligations. I didn't know yet exactly what that meant, but I knew the way you know a storm has already broken somewhere out of sight, that it wouldn't stay hidden much longer. It didn't take long for the rest of it to come apart. Less than 2 weeks after that phone call, I got a message from a woman named Renee, an old Army friend of mine, whose husband coincidentally worked in commercial lending at a regional bank in the same town where Mark ran his business. She wasn't calling to gossip. She was calling because she'd heard my name mentioned in a context that troubled her enough to reach out directly. Her husband had been part of a loan committee reviewing an application from Mark's company, a substantial request meant to refinance existing debt and inject fresh operating capital into a business that was by every metric on paper already in serious trouble. Mark's application had included supplementary documentation referencing anticipated collateral real estate. Collateral specifically tied to a property he described as pending family transfer, complete with an estimated valuation that matched almost to the dollar an old assessment of my grandfather's lake house. When the loan officer had done his due diligence and discovered the property had in fact already been sold months earlier to an entirely unrelated third party, with no connection to Mark whatsoever, the entire application had been flagged for review. Not just denied flagged, the kind of flag that follows a business owner into future applications, the kind that invites questions from every lender he approaches after that. Renee told me this carefully, clearly uncomfortable delivering it, but she said she thought I deserved to know what had actually been happening behind the scenes. I thanked her, and I sat with that information for a long time after we hung up, feeling less triumphant than I expected to feel and more simply quietly confirmed. Word moves fast in small business circles, faster than people like to admit. Within a month, I heard through the same loose network of connections that at least one of Mark's private investors, a man he'd apparently courted for nearly a year, promising him a stake in an expansion plan that hinged on capital secured against that same collateral, had pulled out entirely, citing material misrepresentations in the original pitch. Another investor, according to what filtered back to me, had gone further and consulted a lawyer of his own about whether he had grounds to pursue Mark for the time and preliminary funds he'd already committed, based on assurances that turned out to be built on nothing. The bank loan fell through completely. The business, already limping along on borrowed time before any of this happened, lost the one lifeline that might have kept it upright for another year. I don't know all the details of what happened next inside Mark's company, whether there were layoffs, whether suppliers stopped extending credit, whether the doors stayed open at all, because by that point the story had stopped being about the business and started being about something much harder for my sister to sit with. Emily called me again about 6 weeks after that lawyer conference call, and this time her voice sounded nothing like it had before. No demands, no rehearsed lines, just something quiet and shaken underneath. "Did you know," she asked me, "that he used the house for loans without telling me any of it?" I told her the truth gently, because whatever had happened between us, I didn't take any pleasure in watching her find this out. I didn't know the specifics until after the dinner, but I suspected something wasn't right about how hard he was pushing. There was a long silence on her end, long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When she spoke again, her voice had a rawness to it I hadn't heard from my sister in years, not since we were teenagers, and she'd let her guard down enough to be genuinely scared about something instead of performing confidence over it. He told our financial advisor, our actual joint advisor, that the house money was coming, that we'd have it within the year. I signed off on decisions based on that. I told people at my job I might be able to help fund my daughter's school program because of that money. She stopped, and I could hear her breathing change on the other end, the particular unsteadiness of someone realizing the ground under an entire year of decisions had never actually been there. "He wasn't trying to protect the family, Alexa. He was never doing this for us. He was drowning, and he was going to use your inheritance as a life raft without asking either of us." I didn't say anything triumphant. I didn't remind her of every warning sign she'd ignored every time she'd taken his side against me over the years, every family dinner where she'd let him speak for both of them without question. There was no satisfaction in it, watching my sister's marriage crack open over a truth I'd only helped surface, not caused. "I'm sorry," I told her, and I meant it, though I suspect she understood I wasn't apologizing for selling the house. She didn't say much else that call, but something had shifted in her voice, something that told me the version of Emily who'd stood at that dinner table repeating Mark's talking points wasn't entirely sure anymore who she'd been defending or why. I went back to Montana in late spring, almost a year to the day after that birthday dinner. The lake was doing what it always does that time of year, throwing off the last of its ice in long groaning sheets that cracked like distant gunfire whenever the wind picked up. I drove past the house first, slower than I meant to, taking in the fresh coat of paint the Preservation Trust had put on the porch railings, the small brass plaque now mounted near the front steps, marking its historical designation. It looked cared for. It looked, for the first time in years, exactly like what my grandfather always wanted it to be, not an asset, not a bargaining chip, just a place that mattered. I didn't stop there, though. I drove on to the small cemetery on the hill above town, where he's buried next to my grandmother under a maple tree that turns the whole plot gold every October. I hadn't been back since the funeral. I stood there for a long while with my hands in my coat pockets, the wind coming off the lake carrying that particular cold, clean smell of thawing water, and I found I didn't have much to say out loud. Some conversations don't need words. I think he understood that better than anyone. Mr. Chen had asked to meet me in town that same afternoon, and when I arrived at his small office above the old bank building, he handed me an envelope I hadn't been expecting, a letter my grandfather had written, and sealed nearly 2 years before he died, with instructions that it only be delivered to me once the sale of the house had fully closed, and in his words, once the truth had time to surface on its own. I read it sitting in my truck in the parking lot, engine off, hand steady, even though something in my chest wasn't. If you're reading this, he'd written in that same careful handwriting I remembered from birthday cards and grocery lists taped to the refrigerator. It means they've shown you exactly who they are. I'm sorry for that if it hurts, but I needed you to see it clearly without me standing between you and the truth, because I won't always be here to protect you from people who love what you have more than they love who you are. I never cared what happened to that house, Alexa. Boards and shingles don't need saving. What I cared about was whether anyone in this family would ever ask you what you needed, instead of asking what they could take. I think I already know the answer, or you wouldn't be reading this letter at all. Don't carry guilt for what happened. You didn't break anything that wasn't already broken. You just stopped holding it together for people who were never going to thank you for it. I sat with that letter for a long time before I could fold it back up. There's a particular kind of grief in realizing someone you loved saw the whole shape of your life more clearly than you did yourself, even from years away, even from beyond the point where he could do anything but leave you a letter and hope it landed at the right moment. What I inherited from my grandfather in the end wasn't a house on a lake in Montana. It was something harder to put a price on and a lot more useful to carry. It was permission to stop trying to earn love from people who only valued what I had permission to walk away from a table full of demands without apologizing for the silence I left behind me. Permission to build a life measured by what I gave to people who actually needed it, not by what I handed over to people who simply expected it. Emily and I talk now, occasionally carefully, the way people do when they're rebuilding something from a foundation that cracked once and might crack again if they're not honest with each other. She and Mark separated about 4 months after that phone call with the lawyer, though. I don't know the full details, and I've never asked for them. That part of the story isn't mine to tell. What I do know is that she visited the lake house last fall on her own, and stood on that dock for a while before she came back to tell me about it. I think she understood something out there that she hadn't let herself understand at that dinner table. My grandfather used to say that greed doesn't need to be exposed by anyone. It exposes itself eventually the moment it's asked to wait or share or simply be patient a little longer than it wants to be. He was right about that, the way he was right about most things. I didn't have to fight for the truth to come out. I just had to stop protecting people from the consequences of their own choices, and let the truth find its own way to the surface the way water always does given enough time. I still go back to that lake every summer. I sit on that same porch, coffee going cold in my hands, and I watch the light move across the water the exact same way it did when I was a kid, and I think about how strange it is that the most valuable thing anyone ever left me wasn't a deed or a dollar amount. It was a lesson about who deserves a seat at your table, and who's only ever been sitting there waiting for their turn to take something from it. If this story moved you, I'd love to know where it found you and what part of it stayed with you longest. Have you ever had to walk away from people who only valued what you had instead of who you are? Tell me in the comments below. I read everyone, and I'd genuinely like to hear your story. We share moments like this one every single day, so if you don't want to miss the next one, go ahead and subscribe. Let's keep walking through these stories together, one honest moment at a time.